morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for making the time to join us today. As you know, our topic for today is investments for charities. So speaking to you today is myself, Helen Wilkie. I'm a partner in Saffery's not-for-profit team based in London, and I am a charity audit specialist. And I'm joined by Liz Wild, a director at McInroy Wood. Liz is an investment manager and a director at McInroy Wood. She established the firm's Harrogate office in 2016, having first established her career in London, and she now splits her time between the north of England and London. Liz is a member of the investment team. She's involved in the research, analysis of companies and asset allocation for McInroy Wood funds, as well as for client portfolios. And she manages portfolios for a range of clients, including individuals, families and charities, with a particular interest in smaller companies and the environmental, social and governance aspects of investing. In a personal voluntary capacity, Liz is a trustee of Two Ridings Community Foundation and sits on their investment committee and finance and general purposes committee. And so she brings experience from both sides of the fence, and we're delighted to have her here with us today. If I take us before we begin onto a little bit of housekeeping, you will have heard the button at the start telling you that this webinar is being recorded. No attendees can be seen or heard, and individuals' names will not be used as part of the session. If you would like to ask a question, and we do encourage that, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of this session. You will all receive an email with a link to the recording of this session. It says within 24 hours, that is our aim, but it will be at latest by Monday. And please do help us to continue to provide relevant content by taking a short survey when prompted at the end of this session. So what are we going to be talking about? We'll be talking to you for about 30-40 minutes before we get into the Q&A. Firstly, I'm going to provide a high-level introduction to the world of charity investments, covering what is an investment, different types of investment, and also looking at trustee duties in relation to investments. Liz is then going to talk about financial investments in more depth, focusing on the other bullets that are set out on the screen. So looking at your investment policy, your options, assessing performance, collaborating with your investment manager, and looking ahead at what's on the horizon. We'll wrap up by reminding you about what we've talked about and signpost you some relevant guidance, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Before we begin, we would like to get to know you all a little better, so this is your chance to get involved. We have a couple of polls, which my colleague Lara will be bringing up on the screen for you to join in with. And these will ask you two questions. Firstly, who are you? A finance director, a trustee on the investment committee, and if you're an independent member, I would count yourself in that group, or other. And then we're going to ask you if you've reviewed your investment policy since the CC14 guidance was updated last year. So I'll give you a minute just to answer those questions. So hopefully you can now see the answers on your screen. In terms of who is attending, we've got a whole range of people, including trustees and finance directors. And looking at the poll results on that second question, the great news is that 39% of you have reviewed your investment policy since the guidance was updated last year. A further quarter of you, not yet, but planning to. And 35% of you have answered no. So I don't know whether that's because you haven't got any investments or whether you just haven't got round to it yet, but that might be something to think about following on from today's session. So moving into the body of the session and looking at what is an investment. What you have on the screen is a quote from Oscar, which is the Scottish charity regulator. Now, I appreciate a lot of you will be charities registered with Charity Commission of England and Wales, but it's quite a neat little summary of what an investment is, and explains it's intended to generate a return, to give something back to the person or organisation that owns it. And in a charity context, investments are charity assets used to help the charity deliver its charitable purposes. And when we think about the types of investment, as we move on to the next slide and look at the various investment options and types, there's very much two types of investment, and thinking about how they help you to achieve your purpose is really useful. So firstly, there is the classic traditional financial investment. Charities do, of course, need money to deliver their purposes, and financial investments are a way of using your assets effectively to generate a return that gives you the money you need to do the good work. It could be cash you put on a deposit to generate interest. It could be a property you rent out to generate income. The second type, the Charity Commission very much calls a social investment. So this is where you are investing to directly achieve your charity's purposes. You may also make a financial return, but depending on the purpose of the investment, you may be prepared to accept a lower or even negative financial return, where taken together with the charitable return, the expected return is in your charity's best interests. And when thinking about examples here, so often for social investments, they take a form of a loan. For international INGOs, it could be microfinance to small-scale businesses. It could include direct investment into organisations seeking to create impact towards your aims. Fair by design, shown on the slide, invest in companies, addressing specific aspects of the poverty premium and help support them to innovate and grow to make markets fairer. So I certainly have some clients that invest in that, and that's a way of them helping to achieve their objectives whilst also generating a return. If you have investments or you're thinking about making investment, it's really important that you consider the purpose behind the investments so you can make purpose-led investment decisions. For social investments, you need to think about your aims and expect returns, and you should have some record of this so that it can be reviewed if necessary. Knowing what the purpose of your investments is will help you to think about them strategically and to work out what information you need to monitor performance, which I know is something Liz will be picking up on later. So looking on to trustee duties, as a trustee, what are you allowed to do? Well, the good news is that all charities can make investments. Your powers to invest usually come from one or both of your governing document and the law. And in practice, most trustees have similar wide powers of investment, but it's important you know what rules apply to you and what powers your charity has, and if in doubt, that you seek appropriate legal advice. And what are you required to do? Well, as trustees, you have to act in the best interests of the charity. You have a duty of care as the custodians of the charity's assets, and that means taking more rather than less care of the charity's assets than if it was your own money. That means you've got to use reasonable skill and care, not expose the charity to undue risk, and take advice where necessary. When it comes to financial investments, trustees have a duty to take advice from someone experienced in investment matters, unless they have a good reason for not doing so. So, for example, if you had enough expertise in your trustee group, or you have limited or low value investments. The Commission expects all charities have a written policy, and CC 14, the Commission's guidance on this area, provides guidance on what that policy should cover and things to think about when developing or reviewing it for your charity. Trustees are expected to balance all relevant factors when making decisions and determining their investment policy. So when looking at your investment policy, that would include consideration of potential conflicts and potential reputational and relational risks. And where a reasonable and proportionate investment policy is implemented as a result of a balancing exercise that is conducted properly, the trustees will have complied with their legal duties. But it's really important to go through that balancing exercise to consider what your charity's purposes and plans are and how your investments fit with that, and to make sure that when you make decisions, you document not only the decision, but the basis for the decision. And there are additional considerations if you have restricted or endowed funds. So if you have been given income, it is generally intended to be spent. So you have to think about that before investing the money to make sure you are not holding on to money that the donor intended to be spent, or investing money when actually what you need is cash. If you have endowed funds, you need to think about how your charity gets the balance right between serving current and future beneficiaries, and the level of risk you're prepared to take, as well as the level of return that you need from your investments to pay for your activities. You may want to think about investing on a total return basis rather than simply for income, particularly if you have permanent endowment. Worth saying, I think, that there are some charities that mainly invest cash. I think sometimes where charities keep money in a savings or deposit account, they don't think about themselves as having investments. But keeping money in a savings or deposit account is an investment, and the same legal duties apply to decisions about investing in cash as other investment decisions. For any charities that do invest in cash, CC14 does provide specific guidance on writing your investment policy and managing those investments. And that's all I wanted to say by way of a high-level introduction to charity investments. It has been a bit of a canter through, but I will now pass you over to our guest speaker, Liz Wood, from McInroy Wood, who will provide some deeper insights into the world of financial investments.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for setting the scene so well. So as you will have seen on the agenda, I'm going to cover really sort of three areas. Some points about how you might approach setting the investment policy. We're going to look briefly at investments and the benefits that they can bring over the long term. And finally, think a little bit about how you assess progress towards those goals that you have set out in your investment policy. So before we start, at the end of the presentation, there's a word of caution with all financial services companies. I have to highlight that this webinar and any Q&A does not constitute investment advice or a personal recommendation. So the slide that you can see now is very noisy. There's lots of news clippings there. The world is very noisy, and I appreciate that for trustees, it can be quite daunting how to approach this if you're not a professional in the area. So there's lots of conflicting views. Do you invest? How do you invest? Where do you invest? What do you not invest in? But we're going to sort of step back from that to start with, and we're going to think about what matters to your charity. So when you're thinking about setting your investment policy, you should come back, as Helen said, to what's the purpose of your organisation? What are your values and what are your objectives? So those are things that are really important to you as a group of trustees. And they should guide you through this process. And then you need to move on to some more practical things. And these are the elements that your investment manager will need to understand in order to manage your portfolio appropriately. And again, keep it simple. What, when, how much? Do you need a regular income? What's that level? Do you have some commitments to longer term projects? How are you going to fund those? Do they need to come from an investment portfolio? And again, as Helen mentioned, that you may have stakeholders and you may need to consider their needs or expectations as part of that process. Environmental, social and governance factors are very relevant as well. That may mean that you go through a process of diving into these things and then sort of coming out the other side with a clearer picture, but you do need to think about it, and we'll come on to that later. The reputational risk is another important one of getting it wrong. And if you've gone through the process properly, that should be less of a concern. So you've got those sort of building blocks, the key elements that you need for your investment policy. And then I'd really encourage you to sort of, having discussed it internally, think about talking about it externally to trusted parties, you know, through your networks and through collaborating with other people. You want to see how that investment portfolio sits in terms of the other assets and resources you have at your disposal. And also you want to look backwards to see where you've come from, as well as thinking about where you want to go. So how much should you be distributing? That can be quite a sticky question. And we'll come on to something that might help you in a moment. Again, Helen's mentioned this. You're trying to balance those short-term needs with the long-term objectives of the organisation, whilst also maintaining financial resilience. So I would encourage you to ask and ask and ask again. There are lots of professionals like Helen and others who are either lawyers or investment managers, consultants, who are more than willing to help you. Fellow trustees as well, if you go to any conferences, you know, have a chat with people, see what they're thinking, what they're doing. So then you've got those elements together, you're ready to sort of map out what the future looks like, and then you're ready to write your investment policy, and it will seem a lot less daunting. But one thing I think you should bear in mind is just being very clear about why you've made the decisions you have made. you should be comfortable with those, and all the trustees should be comfortable with them. Doesn't mean you need to know huge amount of detail, but you need to sort of understand why those decisions have been made. If you've gone for a high risk strategy, that may be completely appropriate, but understand why that is the case. Also, I'd encourage you to review your investment policy from time to time. We saw in the poll that some people have already done that, which is brilliant. It's not something that you do once and forget about. Circumstances change, and it may be relevant to go back and look at it again. Another sort of a few pointers, perhaps, when you're filling out the detail, how much do you put into the investment policy? You might want to think a little bit differently. You might want to look at your investment portfolio and think whether that needs to be split. Should there be a sub-fund? Is there a specific, if you can do that, if there's a specific project purpose that perhaps it's appropriate to take a different strategy with? You don't necessarily have to have one strategy for all of your investments. So think about that. Conversations around ESG take time. I think everyone needs to build an understanding of what's important to you as a charity, where there might be some conflicts, where there might be potential reputational risk. But you also need to understand what your investment manager is going to do about that and how they're going to approach it. So that's where collaboration and dialogue is really important, so that your expectations are being met. So having set your investment policy, how do you deliver that? How do you go about achieving that? So more often than not, I expect you will look to an investment professional to help you with that. This is a very simple chart which sort of maps out a couple of different investment assets that you might have: cash, government bonds, property, equities. And what you can see is, as you go up towards the top right-hand corner, the level of risk and the level of return or potential loss rises. So if you stick with cash, you will be taking a much lower risk, but the return that you will achieve from cash will be lower. And likewise with equities, it's the inverse. So the more risk you take, the higher the potential return. But you need to weigh that with the fact that that also means there's a potential higher loss. So if we delve a little bit deeper, just to sort of give you some insight into how returns can vary. So if we take a 10-year view, this is the average annual returns from a variety of different investments over the last 10 years. So what you might have achieved. And if you start with cash, cash is the little yellow bar, and it's sort of dwarfed by everything else. Interest rates have been very low over the last 10 years. They've obviously moved quite significantly in the last 18 months. But if you had kept your money in cash, you would have had quite a low return. And importantly, the red bar sitting beside the cash is inflation, so UK inflation. So you wouldn't have been able to keep up with inflation. And that's important because over time, that means that what you can do with your money is diminished. It changes. So if you had invested in a variety of these different investments, you would probably have beaten inflation. And if you look at the left-hand bar, that is US equities, very strong returns over the last 10 years, up 12% on average every year. But it's not a smooth journey. These may look very kind of organized and sensible, but along the way, we've had lots of bumps. I'm sure some of you will think about what happened during COVID, where there were some very steep falls in investment markets and a lot of uncertainty. And some of you will think back further to the financial crisis in 07, 08, when again, stock markets fell steeply. So how do you manage that risk? How do you choose what to do? Well, one of the key things is having diversification. So there are a lot of benefits of diversifying your assets overall, but having a diversified portfolio helps to manage that risk. So here we have the blue line, if I draw your attention there. So that is a proxy for a mixed asset portfolio. It happens to be one of our funds, the Balance Fund. So this is over a longer time period as well, which I think is important to note. So this is over 24 years. So that mixed asset portfolio had cash, it had government bonds, and it had global equities. And what you can see is it's achieved quite a healthy return over that period. You can see some of those movements up and down and how that journey is not smooth. But interestingly, if you look at the sort of orange salmon colored line below it, that is an index, an equity index, a global equity index. So if you've taken that higher risk by putting all of your money in those equities, you actually wouldn't have achieved the same cumulative return as having a more diversified portfolio. And importantly, if you had stayed with cash and inflation, you can see those at the bottom, the black line and the dotted line. So sometimes your cash return is ahead of inflation, sometimes it's behind, but you're not making a meaningful change in the value of that capital. You might be wondering about the yellow line. The yellow line is gold, and it would be in a very brave, risky decision to put all your money in gold. But that gives you another perspective of how one single asset class might perform. But actually, if you blend them and you diversify them, you probably achieve what you're looking for without taking too much risk. So I mentioned earlier a sort of what if scenario, and these are really useful to do. So you might be able to get some help from your accountant or a friendly investment manager, or your own finance director might be able to help you do this. It just helps you understand where you might want to set your objective, how much risk you might want to take, and also the risk of not doing something and not taking a risk. So again, I've taken a longer term time horizon, and this year we're talking about 50 years. So whilst trustees may have a tenure for a certain number of years, you do need to think about your individual charity and whether it has a longer lifespan expectation when you're thinking about investment policy. So what you've got here, we've imagined that you had £2 million and 50 years. And as you'll have seen from that previous chart, the lines are not smooth, but just for illustration purposes, these lines are smooth. And at the end of each year, you've withdrawn 3%. So that might have been income, that might have been income and capital, but it's 3%, which is a reasonable level to expect to draw. So what happens? So if you go to the middle line, the blue line, that is representative of the interest rate, the average interest rate since 1988 to 2023. So that is around 4.4%. So again, we are now in a period where interest rates have come back up, so they're about 5.25, but over the long term, you might expect interest rates to average at about 4%. So your £2 million at the beginning, you've put it into a bank account, you've got a decent interest rate. What happens? Well, by the end of the 50 years, you've got a little bit more than 2 million. You've got 3.7 million, which is great. You've also been able to take out of the portfolio 4.2 million. So that is from the interest building up and you drawing it out. So that's one type of a return. But if you look at the purple line, this is where things are quite different. So we've just imagined that this is a mixed asset portfolio. It might have some property, it'll have equities, it will have some bonds, it might have some other classes. And we've assumed that it's achieved on average 7% every year. Again, it wouldn't be a smooth journey. And there's a very big difference here. So your 2 million after 50 years might be 12.8 million. And over that period, as you've drawn out 3% every single year, you've actually been able to distribute 9.2 million. So you could play around with different scenarios like this, maybe take a 20-year view, maybe use a 5% drawing, dial the risk up, dial it down. But I think it's quite a useful tool as you're thinking about where to set your investment policy to sort of understand how that might look. So moving on, before I move on, the orange line, I'm sorry, the orange line is what happens if you do nothing. So just £2 million. This shows you how inflation erodes your purchasing power. So 2 million on day one becomes the equivalent of sort of £100,000 in 50 years. So doing nothing is unlikely to be the right decision. So the final section, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how you assess performance. You've set your targets, you've appointed your investment manager, you've got a clear strategy. How do you keep track of whether they're doing a good job? I'd encourage you to focus on the performance you actually achieve. That might sound obvious, but quite often in our industry, we like to talk about relative to this, relative to that. But what's important is if you've set a target, let's say it's inflation plus something, that your portfolio is delivering near to or above that. That's your measure. What have you actually generated in returns? It won't be smooth, so you will have periods where performance is better, and you will have years when it's not reaching that target. And that is an important point. So when you're monitoring and measuring, you will probably think about it every 6 months, every year. But remember what's come before. Keep track of what's happened in the previous 5, maybe 10 years if you've had a portfolio that long, because it's very helpful for you to sort of make those difficult decisions when times are hard and maybe your portfolio has fallen. And that might actually coincide with a greater need for the causes that you support. And if you can look at the history and you can see where you've come from, that might give you confidence as a team to continue making distributions in that year when in the short term performance had been weaker. In terms of what's relevant as a benchmark, again, I think what your stated targeted return is a natural starting point. But again, your investment manager can guide you if there are other things that are important. Inflation in absolute terms can be a good one. Lots of investment managers will create a composite. So they'll put together a benchmark which has similar assets to those that they invest in. So you can see what's happened in wider stock markets or bond markets and compare that with how your portfolio has performed. Another kind of benchmark, if you like, is what the peer group are doing. So what other investment management firms have been doing for charities. So that can also give you a little bit of comfort about whether you've made the right decision. Is your portfolio not only meeting your objectives, but also performing in line with the peer group? But just remember, you're not going to be comparing like with like. You won't have exactly the same investment philosophy approach as another charity or one of these benchmarks. The ultimate kind of review is if you decide to review your investment manager and go through that process of meeting a range of managers. And that can be quite insightful. You might find by the end of that experience, you're not making any change, but hopefully along the way, you will have looked at some different approaches, some different styles, and understood whether those might be useful for you as an organization, or if you're happy where you are. It does take quite a bit of planning. It does take quite a bit of time, but from time to time, it's a useful thing to do. So just a final thing to wrap up before I hand back to Helen. One of the things I wanted to talk about is effective collaboration. Investment managers, we're a friendly bunch, really. We're here to help you. So I would encourage you to talk to your investment manager and be curious, because the closer you are to how they're investing, the better it will be for you, because you'll understand why decisions have been made and why perhaps you're outperforming or you're underperforming at any particular time. It's particularly important, I think, when you're thinking about the risks that may be on the horizon. How well positioned are your investments? Are they taking a cautious view? Is that aligned with your view? Or are they taking more risk, and is that still appropriate? It may well be. The environmental, social, and governance factors, again, I think engaging, asking your investment manager to share some insights about what they're doing and how they're doing it. Do they do it in-house? Do they collaborate with other organizations? That will help you manage your expectations about what they're doing and ensure that it's in line with what you want them to do. Take that long-term view. I would encourage you. We quite often look at very short periods of time, but actually with investments, you need to take a long-term view. And then just finally, a couple of regulatory changes. The Financial Services Regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, is trying again to help you as, clients, customers. They're trying to protect you. They're trying to improve your outcomes. So last year, a new regulatory principle came out called Consumer Duty. And it's a package of things, but really what you should see from that is better communication, better transparency, and firms ensuring that their customer needs come first and foremost, which may seem obvious, but it doesn't always happen. And another thing to have on the horizon is potentially a new anti-greenwashing rule. I think some of the publicity material issued by some firms about their funds, about their ESG credentials, does not stand up to scrutiny, and the regulator is aware of this, and so is changing how and what firms can do in terms of making those claims. So again, that should make things clearer for you about what a firm might do with an investment portfolio. So I'm going to hand back to Helen, and hopefully you've got some questions.
Thanks very much, Liz. So now it's my chance to recap, perhaps give you a minute to think about some questions. If you do have questions, you can ask them using the Q&A button. If you click on the three dots, you should be able to find it. And in terms of what we've discussed, I think, what we've highlighted is that there are choices, lots of choices out there for you, but also a lot of noise. And that noise can be scary and confusing, and I think can be barriers to entry for the non-experts in the room. And what Liz has provided is some really valuable practical tips about how to dial down that noise and think about what really matters for your charity, so that you can have constructive conversations internally as a board, thinking about your strategy, thinking about your plans, thinking about your cash flows, but also with your investment manager and others, and be able to explain to them what your strategy and philosophy is, and ask them how you can best achieve your plans. It's okay to not be a subject matter expert. I think asking for advice, as we said, is really important to do. It is something the Commission expects you to do and encourages. And Liz is absolutely a subject matter expert in this area, and I am not. So if I was investing, I would certainly be talking to an investment manager for a bit of help if I didn't have that expertise on my board. I think the old adage is true. If you really understand your subject, you'll be able to explain it in plain English. And again, I think that's something Liz has done really well this morning, avoiding all the acronyms that we're all so used to and perhaps hate and perhaps don't really understand but don't dare ask in case we seem stupid. And I think this is saying actually it's okay to ask those questions. It's okay to ask what a benchmark means and is it relevant? And it's really important to keep things under review regularly. Don't come up with a policy and then put it in a drawer and roll it out in your accounts year after year. Have a think about it. The world is moving. Your plans and strategy of charity is evolving. Expectations are changing in society. And so there will be reasons to keep revisiting your policy, and not necessarily to change it, but just to check that it's still where it needs to be, and fit for purpose. And in terms of just some signposts to further guidance before we move on to questions, that is there, provide some. On this slide, there is some guidance you might find useful, particularly if you're looking at governance around investments for your charity. So the Charity Governance Code does not address investments specifically or explicitly, but the guidance in the code, a lot of it has some really broad application. particularly the section on decision making, risk and control, I think is relevant if you're looking at the governance you have around investments and how to get that right. CC27 is Charity Commission guidance about making decisions for your charity and ensuring that important decisions are carefully considered. And not only the decision made, but the reason for that decision is documented is really important, particularly when you're thinking about strategic or significant decisions. And around investments, perhaps how they could affect the charity's assets or the charity's exposure to risk. CC14 is, of course, the guidance published by the Charity Commission on Investments. It was refreshed last year following the Butler-Sloss case, and it's clearer and more concise, and it includes examples that can help you decide how to apply the principles to your charity. Importantly, it again reminds charities to review their policy regularly and discuss it with new trustees. And it's a live area and expectations are changing, so it's not easy. And for charities based in Scotland or others just looking for further guidance, Oscar has also published guidance on this area. It includes top 10 key points. I quite like top 10 tips, and that's a handy crib sheet and a reminder of many of the key points that we've covered here today. And lastly on the slide, looking ahead on the horizon, Charity Finance Group is developing charity investment governance principles in partnership with sector bodies and experts. Their goal is to create a set of principles for trustees and leaders to use when developing their investment policies and making decisions about investing charity funds. It's due to be launched at Charity Finance's annual conference in June of this year, so watch this space. And that brings me to the end of this. So now is an opportunity for you to ask questions. If they're very specific, we may take them offline and I'll share our contact details at the end of this. But Liz, I'm sure some of these questions are mainly going to be for you. And the first one is around ethical investments. So it's not something we specifically addressed, but the question is it assumes that if you're a charity, you will be making ethical investments? And how can you be a charity if you don't make ethical investments?
Okay, so it's quite a big question. I think there's a perception that if you're a charity, you will make ethical investments. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to. I think it comes back to thinking about your organisation and, as we said, what the purpose is, what your values are, and how you align those. So it's quite a wide topic, because what do we mean by ethically? Because there are the current sort of metrics, if you like, that people measure these things by are environmental, social and governance factors. But again, it's a very wide and deep subject. And what one individual might perceive as being ethical, another individual might not. And you as a board of trustees have to decide what's appropriate for the charity. So you have to remove that personal kind of view on it. I think also when you're thinking about investments, there's quite an interesting development that's happened over the last sort of 5 or 10 years. And Helen, you've spoken about it really, the sort of impact investing, the mixed motive investing. So that's one area where charities can proactively sort of look and do things which might fit into that ethical sort of category. I think the most important thing is about reputational risk. If you are a cancer charity, do you want to find that you have tobacco or other elements that are clearly linked to that disease that you're trying to sort of, challenge and cure? That's probably where you want to start. But it needs to be a conversation, because you need to test things. Sometimes charities say, these are areas we do not want to have investment in, but we're comfortable with. So let me give you an example. So some companies might say they don't want to have exposure to mining companies because they obviously have quite a negative impact on the environment. So if you're a nature-based charity, that would be a natural thing that you might consider. But if we are going to make an energy transition, we need metals and we need to mine them. So how do you square that circle? That's the sort of conversation you need to have with your investment manager, because it's not as straightforward as saying, I don't want to have any exposure to X. You would kind of, there is a range, if you will. So I'd encourage a discussion and also internal clarity about what you mean by these different terms.
I think just to add to that, in the refresh CC14 guidance, in the section on financial investments, one of the things they cover is this kind of concept of ethical, and they set out some approaches you might take. So maybe that's investing purely for the best financial return you can achieve, and actually that works for your charity. But they also set out some examples of other things that you might factor in, picking in up many of the points that Liz has just discussed there. But if you want a reference guide and some bullets and prompts for conversations internally as a trustee board, looking at CC14 at the section on financial investment might help to prompt those and facilitate that conversation. The next question, again, Liz, I'll direct this to you because it's very much about working with your investment manager. In terms of setting benchmarks, who would you expect to set those if you have an investment manager and also fund managers? The particular person who's asked this question says they have one investment manager but 2 or 3 fund managers, and who should be looking at those benchmarks and setting them?
Okay, so I'm slightly blind here, but so I think it's a discussion with your investment manager, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to find that your investment manager is managing your portfolio to the benchmark. The benchmark it's a sense check, it's a reference point, but what you can find is that sometimes if a benchmark is set, which, as I mentioned earlier, might be a composite. So you might have, let's say, 60% in global equities, you might have 10% in property, 10% in government bonds. What you want that investment manager to do is not manage a portfolio in that way. You want them to achieve the returns that you're looking for. And that should be there as a guide as to whether they're doing a good job or not. But again, the proof of the pudding is what they actually deliver in terms of a result. So it may be a situation, Helen, where there's an umbrella. So there's an investment manager, and beneath that, perhaps there are 3 sub-funds or something like that. And they may have specific strategic objectives. So I would say that it's a collaboration with the investment manager, but try and ensure that you're not having your portfolio managed to a benchmark. What's important is your targeted return, what you're looking to achieve.
And I think one last question, Liz, unless anyone pops up with anything else. In terms of getting the balance on the asset allocation right, would 50% in UK equities be too much? How do you know what's too much in one area?
Okay, so 50% is quite a lot in anything. So whether it's UK equities or not, and again, what's the investment objective here? Historically, a lot of investment portfolios had a lot of exposure to the UK market, partly when they were looking for income, because dividends that UK businesses were able to distribute were quite high, so that made them quite attractive. Diversification comes in lots of different forms, so currency, regions, asset classes. And I think having anything at 50%, whether it's US equities or government bonds, feels too high. But that's for you to discuss with your investment manager. You want to have it diversified. You want to find a range of different sectors where you have equity, so you're not overly exposed to one sector. And that's just all part of the way in which investment managers manage the risk. So I would say no to 50% in anything.
And we do have one final question before I draw things to a close. So the question is, do we have a top tips list that we can share on how to calculate how much you can invest and for how long, particularly for those new to investments? And I think if I start on this one, Liz, and then do chip in with anything you want to add, I think deciding how much you can invest as a charity, I would suggest that you look at how much you have, what's your reserves level, really think about your reserves policy and your forecasts and your plans. Because if you're going to invest, you are tying up money for a certain period. So you need to know how much money you need and how much you can afford to invest for future spending before you make that decision. So it's not necessarily something that Liz could answer or something that your auditors or accountants could answer. but it's really closely linked to your strategy and your reserves policy and your investment policy. And those three things are not, Liz and I were talking about this, we said those things, they're not separate. If you think about sort of Venn diagram, the amount you can invest has to bring in consideration of reserves, strategy and investments in the one piece before you decide how much you can invest. And then I think determining what you invest in and for how long is possibly where Liz comes in, and you have that conversation about risk and asset allocations and time horizons.
Yeah, I think so. All investment managers have got a responsibility to ensure that the way in which they're managing a charity or a client's portfolio is suitable. So that's a technical term, but what it means is it avoids that situation where you have an individual or a charity taking too much risk, because you do need to think about investment certainly on a minimum of a 3 to 5 year basis. So again, one of the questions that we frequently ask is, do you have any need to draw on this portfolio in the next 1, 3, 5 years? And if the answer is yes, the question is, why are you investing that money? There's probably another way to safeguard that money, perhaps earn a little bit interest, but if you know that you need it within that short time frame, investing may not be the right way to go about it. We've also seen quite a lot of potential clients where, again, they have split their funds and perhaps they've got an ongoing project where they've got known liabilities in the future. And there may be something you can do around that, but that's very specific. And so you might sort of use perhaps even government bonds where you know what the maturity is, you know what return you'll get for those. But yeah, I think you've described it quite well, Helen. It really depends on the situation.
And with that, I will draw it to a close. If you have got further questions, our contact details are on the final slide. As I say, I'm very much in the audit account space, so I can't go giving you specific investment questions for those. You'd want to be reaching out to Liz or your own investment manager. But do drop us a line if there are things you think we can help with offline. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.